If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. I'm back with a normal solo episode after kind of a little bit of a crazy past, I don't know how many weeks it's been since the election happened and the fallout from that. I've been doing so many live streams and spaces and panels, and so like the YouTube side of things has been pretty busy, but recording normal episodic entries has been a little bit rough, and I've kind of done what I can to keep things going there. And I've had a couple episodes I've been ready to record for a while and just needed time to sit down and focus and do it. So today is one of those episodes. So I'm going to be tackling a question that is still timely, a little complex, and it's related to a lot of this fallout that's been going on since the election. Can Christians faithfully engage in politics? And can they support secular coalitions? Can they work alongside governments without compromising our faith? So, the election cycle is behind us, but these questions are going to keep popping up, not just because there's more elections, but because coalitions and these sort of things don't just happen every 4 years or every 2 years or just when you go to the voting booth. Christians and libertarians, I think, have to consider this, from two different angles. And I kind of got into this on the last regular episode where I talked about the article I wrote on X, which was Living Liberty. And it was about how to, sort of thoughtfully live out liberty and try to engage with the real world, and to not make libertarianism something that's just in the realm of the ideological, but not something that ever touches reality, not something that ever makes a difference in the world around you, right? If you have a philosophy that kind of makes you useless or ineffective in the real world, you might want to consider that maybe it doesn't mean the whole philosophy is wrong, doesn't mean that everything about your assumptions are wrong, but maybe at some point along the way in your calculus, maybe there's some errors that need to be addressed. But I want to talk about this a little bit more, and a little bit more from the perspective of Scripture as well, because I think that, as I talked about last week, that there's this grappling that Christians and libertarians have when it comes to involvement in the world, and how much involvement is too much, and how much is perhaps warranted. If you were paying attention to this election cycle, you've probably noticed that there were many arguments and disagreements about the role of Christians in politics. This is true with libertarians as well. So I'm going to share sort of like the background here, that there was a lot of Christians and libertarians who decided to support Donald Trump. And of course, if you guys have been paying attention, you know that I also decided to vote for Donald Trump, although I would say that my vote was complicated. Really, it was a vote against Kamala Harris, and it was not voting for Trump, but more like voting for the people who were around Trump. But certainly there's a lot of libertarians who decided to vote Trump because, to some extent, him and the people around him are advancing certain libertarian-friendly policies, like freeing Ross Ulbricht, reducing the size of the federal government, even the idea of appointing libertarians or libertarian adjacent, libertarian friendly people to his cabinet. And beyond Trump, there were coalitions around him, like Rescue the Republic, which I talked about a couple months ago. I had Angela McArdle on to talk about, and Clint Russell. And there's advocates for this sort of like coalition and cooperation across ideological lines and even across political partisan lines, for these people to kind of come together and sort of protect certain core civil liberties and to sort of push back against what people call the regime or the deep state, the entrenched bureaucracy, sort of like corporate America. There's a lot of different, it's almost like what's the term here? It's like a hydra, right? Like it's a beast with different heads, but they all kind of stem from the same body. It's more like the same evil that a lot of these different groups are struggling against. A lot of common causes that are at play here, like medical freedom, anti-war, criminal justice reform, etc. But these partnerships bring up questions like, does aligning with secular figures or these coalitions mean that we're compromising our faith from the Christian perspective? Are we unequally yoked if we partner with non-Christians in these political efforts? So I think like last episode and the article I wrote dove more into the libertarian side of things, and this is going to be focusing more on the Christian side of things, because there are some believers that argue that by joining forces with secular or even morally questionable groups, we risk diluting or even betraying our ultimate allegiance to Christ and his kingdom. They point to passages that they interpret to be teaching Christians and commanding Christians to steer clear of any cooperation with secular society. Before I get any further, I just want to remind you that wherever you're watching this, give this video a thumbs up, or if you're listening on the audio side, please consider giving this podcast a 5-star review, boost our ratings in the algorithms of these various podcatchers. I also just want to remind people that we are in the final countdown, the final month of the fundraising drive we have going on at the Libertarian Christian Institute. So if you go to libertarianchristians.com or go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com, you'll see a little donate button pop up. And you'll see that until the end of 2024, every dollar donated will be matched by a generous challenge grant from the LCI board up to $15,000. And so right now, at the time of my recording this, we're up to $2,000. So we have another $13,000 to go. Please consider, just a one-time donation if you can. And if you, as always, sign up for $10 or more a month, you can become an LCI insider and get all sorts of perks going into the new year. So, all right, getting back into what we're here to talk about, the questions that people have about these partnerships and what's the role of Christians in society. A lot of Christians, even Christian libertarians, think that our job is to, be separate from society. God, Christ's kingdom is not of this world, right? But is that the full picture of what the Bible teaches? See, when we look at the Bible, we see a wealth of teachings and examples of how to speak to how believers are able to relate to the world around them. On one hand, there is a clear call to be set apart and to live in a way that reflects God's holiness and stands against the sinfulness of the world. But on the other hand, there's also a call to engage, to be salt and light, to seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Jesus tells us to be in the world, but not of it. So where's the balance? How can we engage with the world without becoming entangled by it? This is the tension I want to explore, diving into scripture and into what sort of church tradition has been with this. So when it comes to the question of how Christians should engage in the world, some of the most frequently cited verses do emphasize some degree of separation, drawing a clear line between the lifestyle of a believer and that of the world. And these passages would caution us about the dangers of association with secular or sinful influences, and they're often referenced by those who believe that Christians should avoid any political involvement or coalition building with non-believers. First passage would be that I want to bring up is Ephesians 5:11, which says, "Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them." This verse appears in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, a letter written to encourage a young Christian community in a largely pagan society. In the preceding verses, Paul instructs believers to walk as children of light and to not be partners with those who engage in immoral behavior. So here, Paul is drawing a contrast between the way of life for Christians, one that reflects God's light and righteousness, and the ways of the surrounding culture, which often indulges in practices that are counter to God's will. The call to take no part in the works of darkness is indeed a strong one, and it's easy to interpret this as a mandate for Christians to avoid not just sinful behaviors, but any association with non-believers who engage in them. However, it's essential to understand that Paul's focus here is on avoiding participation in sinful acts rather than avoiding all contact with non-believers. The verse isn't necessarily about isolation from the world, but about remaining distinct in our conduct. Paul is urging believers to live in a way that exposes the emptiness of a sinful lifestyle, not by isolating themselves, but by embodying an alternative, the light of Christ, the fruit of a transformed life, I would say. Another verse that comes up in discussions of separation is 2 Corinthians 6:17. Paul writes, "Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, then I will welcome you." Here, Paul quotes the Old Testament, drawing on language familiar to his Jewish audience. The context of this verse is Paul's warning against being unequally yoked with unbelievers, which is from 2 Corinthians 6:14, a phrase that conjures the image of two animals yoked together to pull a plow. In this metaphor, an unequal yoke suggests that one partner will end up dragging down the other or veering off course. Paul's warning here is often interpreted as a directive for believers to avoid partnerships that might compromise their faith or draw them into behaviors that dishonor God. In ancient Israel, the call to be separate was a part of the Mosaic law and tended to keep God's people from adopting the idolatrous practices of neighboring nations. However, Paul's emphasis here is not on avoiding all relationships with non-believers, but on avoiding relationships that would lead to spiritual compromise. In other words, the call to be separate doesn't necessarily mean physical separation. It means a separation in values and purpose, and a refusal, ultimately, the most important part here is a refusal to be led away from one's commitment to Christ. John 15:19 adds another layer to this discussion. Jesus says, "If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." So in this verse, Jesus is preparing his disciples for the opposition they will face. He's explaining that their identity as followers will put them at odds with the world, a term that in John's gospel often refers to the systems and values that are opposed to God's kingdom. Jesus' words here are a reminder of the cost of discipleship. Following Christ means living in a way that may seem foreign or even offensive to the surrounding culture. The world hates Christ's followers not because they are isolated, but because they represent a different allegiance, a commitment to God's kingdom rather than to the priorities and values of a fallen world. This verse isn't a command, though, to avoid all interactions with non-believers, but just an acknowledgement that living faithfully will often lead to tension and even persecution. 1 John 2 is another passage here, I think the last one I have, that speaks to the theme of separation. "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." John's warning here addresses the dangers of attachment to worldly values. The world in this passage refers to a set of desires and priorities that are rooted in self-centeredness rather than love for God. But the call, again, is not to avoid the physical world or the people in it, but to avoid being captivated by its values. So these passages certainly, collectively, and others that I could cite as well, they definitely emphasize the need for spiritual vigilance. They remind us that as Christians, we are called to a life that is distinct from the values and behaviors that are often celebrated by secular society. But the caution here is not about isolation from non-believers. It's more about maintaining purity of the heart and to resist worldly temptations. The focus is on, in each of these cases, the focus is on personal holiness and spiritual integrity. It would actually be, I think pretty silly to think that these need to be taken to the logical conclusion one could almost take if you're saying it's a teaching to be separate would be that you have to avoid all interactions with people because That's the only way to avoid temptation. But I don't think we're called to avoid temptation to the extent that it means that we cut ourselves off. That would be, I think, to go too far in the other direction. Rather, we have to have discernment. And that is the challenge, right? We have to have discernment in how to navigate our relationships with the world in a way that maintains the sense of separation of the heart and of values and the way we live, but without descending into complete isolation. How can we live as children of light without hiding that light under a blanket or a bushel? How can we avoid being unequally yoked while still building relationships that allow us to be a witness to others? That is where we have to really dive in and study and seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit and kind of evaluate the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And these questions set the stage for exploring other passages I want to bring up that would kind of, balance this out a little bit, where they're encouraging engagement with the world, showing that even though we're called to be distinct, we're also called to bring God's light into places of darkness. So we've talked about how there are scriptures that emphasize separation. Now we're going to talk about ones that sort of, we're going to juxtapose that with ones that talk about how we can have a foundation for faithful engagement with society. A good example comes from Jeremiah 29, verse 7, where God speaks to the Israelites who were exiled in Babylon. And he says, to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Now, this message was radical because it called God's people to care for a nation that had conquered and displaced them. Babylon was a foreign empire, and it was hostile to Israel's beliefs and customs. Yet God instructed the Israelites to work for its prosperity. Rather than withdrawing from society and focusing on rebellion or even just like nonviolent resistance, they were instead told to actively pursue the welfare of the place they found themselves in, despite its imperfections and even at times oppositions to God and God's law. So this command underscores the idea that God's people can and sometimes must engage in seeking the good of the societies that they're part of, even if those societies don't share their values. By working for the prosperity of Babylon, the Israelites weren't compromising their faith. Instead, they were living out God's call to be a blessing to the nations. In today's context, this principle suggests that Christians can similarly participate in secular systems and institutions, contributing to the good of the nations and communities we live in, and that doesn't automatically compromise our ultimate allegiance to God and his kingdom. Another relevant teaching is found in Luke 10, where Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this story illustrates how mercy and compassion can transcend societal boundaries. Jesus' audience would have been shocked by the Samaritan's role in that story, as Samaritans were generally despised by the Jews and seen as religious and cultural outsiders. But by making the Samaritan the compassionate figure who helps a wounded Jew, Jesus challenges his listeners to broaden their understanding of the term neighbor. The parable suggests that showing love and compassion isn't limited by ethnic differences or cultural differences or religious differences. In fact, it's in these very acts of mercy, especially when they cross boundaries, that we fulfill God's command to love our neighbors. So the Good Samaritan is an example that illustrates cooperation with those who are different and even opposed to us isn't necessarily wrong. And Jesus seems to imply that it's our responsibility to care for others regardless of their background or even their beliefs or lifestyles. And I would say that this idea extends to even coalition building on issues like justice and mercy and aid for the poor and for those who are needy, where Christians can work alongside others for not just like the common good, but for godly purposes. All right, everyone, taking a little bit of break here just to do a little bit of an ad read for LCI. And I just wanted to remind you guys that here at the end of the year, we are doing a push to try to really expand what we're doing next year here at the Libertarian Christian Institute. And we have a very generous challenge grant where we're getting every dollar you donate between now and the end of the year will be matched up to $15,000. And so if you like what we do here, if you like what I do, the articles we write, if you like, when we go to different events like Freedom Fest or the Liberty by the Pint event that we participated in, and you want to see more of that, and you want to see us, be able to push to get on bigger platforms, then your support is crucial to that. Please help us to be able to reach more with this vital message of faith, of liberty, of God's kingdom, and how the gospel impacts not just our salvation and our eternal hope in Christ, but that it impacts our lives and our ability to get along with and love our neighbors. So I'm going to continue now. I had to pause in the middle of recording the episode and come back to it. And so I want to pick up now. Don't be too distracted by the change of clothing or anything like that for you video listeners. So I want to bring up another passage now in 1 Corinthians 9:22. Paul writes, "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." Paul is describing his approach in ministry, emphasizing a flexibility that allows him to meet people where they are. He's willing to adapt his methods and approach to relate to various groups without compromising his core beliefs. This adaptability is not about compromising faith, but about removing barriers that might prevent others from hearing the gospel. Paul's example offers a precedent for building relationships across cultural, social, or religious divides. And rather than isolating himself from non-believers, Paul sought to understand their perspectives and engage with them in ways that respected or at least incorporated their contexts. In our modern world, this approach suggests that Christians can, with discernment, work alongside people of different backgrounds for shared goals, whether in specific ministries or community service, or even political efforts in the pursuit of justice or peace. I would say Romans 12 here provides additional encouragement and context. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Here, Paul is advocating for a proactive pursuit of peace, instructing believers to strive for harmonious relationships with others, and that includes non-believers. This isn't about compromising our values, but embodying a peaceable spirit that reflects Christ's love. And I would say that part of that little tidbit there, as far as it depends on you, I don't think that's a passive command in terms of just like, well, just sit back and try not to cause any trouble, but that to live peaceably with all is actually a proactive command, that to bring peace to the world, to bring light in the world, to be salt and light in the world. These are active things. And so we have to live this teaching out. And I would say that part of that, not all of it, but a part of that can be, and often cases I would say should be, coalition work or public engagement. And Christians can live out this teaching by working towards solutions that benefit society, aiming for justice and peace without forsaking our faith. Matthew 5 echoes this sentiment, where he says, "Blessed are the peacekeepers, for they shall be called sons of God." What does it mean to be a peacemaker? Now, if you ask, war hawks and neocons and sort of the conventional, like American government wisdom, it's peace through strength, right? It's peace through, well, we're just going to be this giant military empire, this giant bureaucratic regulatory machine, and we're going to have peace through control, peace through coercion. But I don't think that's the Christian model. Rather, I would say that, and also I don't think to be a peacemaker, again, would be to take on a passive role in society either. Because it's not a peace observer, it is a peacemaker. And so I would say that, again, the ultimate peace we pursue as Christians is peace between us and God. But we should also seek, again, to make a peace between men in the pursuit of making peace, in the pursuit of living peaceably with all as far as it depends on us, in pursuit of loving our neighbor, in pursuit of showing Christ to the world. Because part of our witness and part of how we demonstrate the gospel to the world is in how we love our neighbors, is in how we care for the least of these. And so Being a peacemaker requires an active effort to bring reconciliation and harmony to fractured relationships and communities. And peacemaking often requires crossing boundaries and working with others to achieve a greater good. So then another passage here would be John 17, verses 15 through 18. And this says, Jesus is praying for his disciples, "I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world." Jesus acknowledges that while his followers are not of the world, they are still sent into it with a purpose. And this passage is part of what's known as the high priestly prayer, where Jesus is preparing his disciples for their mission after his departure. His prayer emphasizes that their role isn't one of isolation, but of active engagement with society, even as they remain distinct, again, as we talked about before, in their values, in their beliefs, in their hearts, living by the Spirit. We don't compromise our values. We do live in our lifestyles as individuals, as a Christian community. It's distinct from the world, but that we should bring that distinctiveness and the act of service, the Christ-like act of service, which is an attribute, an important part of the gospel, important part of the Christian vocation. These things have to be integrated. So Jesus' words suggest that Christians are meant to be a transformative presence within the world, is the way that I would describe that. And we must guard against sin and the corrupting influences of the world, but we have to still engage with it. And we have to work to reflect God's love, justice, and mercy. Jesus' prayer here provides a balanced perspective, affirming the call to holiness and the call to participate in the world as ambassadors of God's kingdom. Together, these passages in Jeremiah, Luke, Corinthians, Romans, Matthew, and John encourage a model of engagement where Christians are both in the world and distinct from it. Rather than withdrawing, we are to actively promote peace, justice, and mercy, and to work towards the common good, even in collaboration and in the presence of non-believers. There's no contradiction between those goals. Now I want to explore some specific examples of how God's people have done this in the past, working with non-believers. Throughout the Bible, we see God's people interacting with secular authorities in ways that advance his purposes. Joseph, Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther, Paul. We're going to examine them. The first example is Joseph. His story, Genesis 37 through 50. Obviously, I think we all know this story. He's sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned, but then Joseph eventually rises to a unique position of power under Pharaoh, becoming Egypt's second in command. And then his unique ability to interpret dreams, a gift from God, earns him Pharaoh's trust, where he interprets a troubling dream and foretells 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. His story is one of resilience, faith, but also a purpose. And then rather than isolating himself from Egypt, Joseph engages and devises a plan that saves Egypt, but then also it benefits neighboring nations, including his own family that he saves and is reconciled through this. Now, obviously, God is sovereign in orchestrating what's happening here, and he works great evil for good. The evil that he works is the persecution that Joseph unjustly goes through by being sold into slavery and then being unjustly imprisoned. Joseph doesn't feel like, well, there's a mixture here. There's a compromising of values. You could say Joseph turns the other cheek and is humble and he's obedient to God, and he's able to cooperate with those who aren't, those chosen by God, who aren't, fully righteous, who engaged in certainly plenty of sinful practices, but towards the common good of all involved. Daniel, his life offers several examples of faithful engagement with a secular system. The book of Daniel recounts his life as a young Jewish exile in Babylon, taken out of his homeland, thrust into a foreign culture. Well, David remains faithful to God while serving in the courts of several pagan rulers, including Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and Darius of Persia. And like Joseph, Daniel has unique gifts, wisdom, and the ability to interpret dreams. And so he becomes advisors to these kings. And in Daniel 6, with King Darius, the advisors, the officials who are jealous of Daniel, of course, create that plot. They had the law passed where everyone can only pray to Darius, and Daniel continues to pray to God. They're into the lion's den. We all know this story. So obviously, we don't compromise on our values, and we do worship God alone. And no coalition and no entanglement, no working for the common good should ever compromise that. And so Daniel gives us a good example of how to do that and how God can preserve us through these sorts of circumstances. And when we're willing to pursue good but not willing to compromise on our values, we actually sort of plant the fields for great harvests of God's spirit, of God's work, God's provision to come and to be transformative, not only in the preservation of our lives, but in the witness of that gospel faith to the broader community. Nehemiah, with the Persian king and court, and he is able to, I'm trying to summarize stuff here for time, he wants to go back and rebuild his homeland. And rather than just sort of like ignoring the governing authorities, he uses his position to, he was a cupbearer in the Persian king Artaxerxes' court. And so this position gave him access to the king. So he uses this permission to approach the king and ask for permission and resources to rebuild Jerusalem, which the king grants. And there's a cooperation and collaboration that happens there, working with a foreign government. And Nehemiah remains faithful to his calling and to his faith, but uses his position to advocate for the well-being of his people. Esther is another example of how God can use his people within secular systems. And I think we know the story of Esther well. Paul has interactions with Roman authorities and in that very hostile political climate post-resurrection, in the early days of the church. And Paul used legal means when he was unjustly imprisoned in Philippi in Acts 16, and sort of like invokes his rights as a Roman citizen, invokes the legal system, and one could say like, well, this system is illegitimate, it was corrupt, but Paul is using his position and he is navigating the legal system skillfully and using it to ensure fair treatment and even to use it to create an opportunity for sharing the gospel with people. And I would say that there's, lessons and implications that we can draw from that. So as we look at, to draw things to a close here, as we look at these examples of faithful engagement with secular authorities, the question remains, how do these examples translate into our world today? Christians today face a landscape that's both politically charged and morally complex. And many of us are wrestling with how to engage thoughtfully in political systems and coalitions that include non-believers or promote agendas that align with parts of our values, but not necessarily all of them. And this is true for libertarians as well. It was relevant as many considered coalitions with political figures or supporting political figures like Donald Trump, like Vivek Ramaswamy, like RFK Jr., etc. A lot of those in the new upcoming administration who have made promises, who have campaign positions that overlap with what Christians and libertarians are concerned with, what we care about. And I'm not saying that everything I've given here is necessarily a demonstration that those particular coalitions or that those particular collaborations or those particular candidates or potential government leaders are good. And I would say that what we should do is be open. We should be open to cooperating and working within these spaces to pursue what is good, but while maintaining vigilance to know that at any point in time, our values could be compromised, and then we would have to stand firm on the gospel and stand firm on God's law and not the law or the values of this world. And so we have to balance these things and we have to find an integration there. But I would say that there are things about this upcoming administration that are worthy of at least a little bit of cautious optimism. And we know that there are opportunities to pursue peace. There are opportunities to repeal government in our private lives. And if it doesn't work out, then we continue to work. We don't call what is evil good. And if the incoming administration, I would say it's simple as this: when the incoming administration does something good, we celebrate that. We encourage that. If there's opportunities to bring something good into fruition, we should work towards that. But if they are working towards something that is bad, and if they do something that is conflicting with liberty or conflicting with the law of God, then we call that out and we peacefully oppose that. And we, at all times, maintain our allegiance to Christ and his kingdom above all things. This is a hard path, but the path is narrow, as they say. And I would say that I think the passages that I've brought to bear show that while we cannot completely conform to the ways of the world, nor can we isolate from it. We have to faithfully engage and be salt and light, spread the gospel, and collaborate for the good of our communities, the good of our nations, and for the good of even those who haven't heard the gospel yet, who haven't accepted the gospel yet. And that this can be an effective, and I'd say it's actually an important means by which we can advocate and spread the gospel and Christ to this fallen world. That is what I will leave you with, guys. We'll probably have one more episode here before the end of the year, and I'll be excited to talk to you guys in the next episode about a lot of exciting things that are coming down the pipeline. And yeah, that's all I have. Live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.